How many trained spellcasters canonically exist, at minimum, in the official setting of D&D's 5th edition, The Forgotten Realms? I read every published adventure set between 1485 and 1495 and scoured them, counting anything from first level acolytes to the dozens of archmages that are said to exist in these books. And I arrived at the minimum count of 959. But in terms of what makes that number interesting or meaningful, well, you'll have to keep watching. There are those who suggest that spellcasters, especially trained or high-level spellcasters, should be vanishingly rare in D&D worlds. Heck, even the creator of The Forgotten Realms, Ed Greenwood, once posited that only 1 in 40,000 people in his setting had the gift with which they could potentially learn magic. Later, revised estimates of 1 in 9,000 take into account the numerous species that do exist in these D&D worlds that can innately cast spells, like drow, tieflings, and some gnomes. In 1372, the setting of the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms, the entire population of Faerûn, which is the continent on which all of D&D's 5th edition Forgotten Realms adventures take place, that population is around 68 million. Even if we assume that by 1495 this has swelled to 100 million, despite multiple world-spanning catastrophes, that still leaves us with around 11,000 spellcasters if we assume the 1 in 9,000 statistic. According also to the 3rd edition guide to the Forgotten Realms, there are more drow living in Menzoberranzan, one city, than the expected volume of spellcasters in Faerûn. And yes, the drow do all have innate spellcasting. The rules in Out of the Abyss for creating your own NPCs using the drow template includes innate spellcasting. So even if we assume that, say, their children haven't yet mastered spellcasting, the population of Menzoberranzan is the entire budget of spellcasters across the Forgotten Realms with the 1 in 9,000 estimate. The entire spellcaster budget blown on one population centre. Clearly, these estimates don't make any sense. I knew about this issue before I started this project of counting, every single spellcaster confirmed to exist in a 10-year stretch on Faerûn. And so in collecting this data, I made a decision. I decided that I wasn't going to count any creature that had innate spellcasting, that uses innate spellcasting to do its magic. And this is where our first really interesting wrinkle is raised. Every single one of those 959 spellcasters confirmed to exist by my research is a leveled spellcaster. In fact, in the vast majority of their stat blocks across all of the books, that level is explicitly stated. And these levels can be much higher than you might think. Every single one of these 959 spellcasters has a spellcasting class somewhere under the hood of their stat block. And although in most cases they're missing the kind of player-facing subclass features, it would be unreasonable to say that the priest stat block is not a 5th level cleric, or the mage stat block not a 9th level wizard. After all, they're a 9th level spellcaster who has the following wizard spells prepared. This is fairly cut and dry. I've seen arguments in the past which have suggested that the spells, classes, and advancements available in the player's handbook are there for player characters only. Frankly, given how stat blocks are displayed across D&D's 5th edition adventures, that does not seem to be the case. Perhaps subclass features, perhaps specific features like arcane recovery. Yes, they are not included in stat blocks. Perhaps there is a NPC wizard version of the wizard class, but the spellcasting, the levelling, all of this indicates fairly clearly to me that these NPCs are levelled spellcasters. What I want to do today is first explain how we arrive at our number, and how much higher that number could reasonably be. And then I'd like to dive into what this means. which locations and adventures have the most spellcasters, and why one officially published 5th edition adventure contains 0 trained spellcasters at all. Through this, I hope to convince you that spellcasting is nowhere near as rare as most people assume in D&D, and that seemingly innocuous, in-the-moment decisions can have massive consequences for a world. So how did we arrive at this number? First, I used a very helpful article on the AlphaStream game design blog as a basis for our 10-year slice of history. This blog identifies as formal of an adventure timeline as it is possible to make. And I only looked into adventures which feature on that timeline, where their timeline can be nailed down to some point between 1485 and 1495. I'm not delving into Baldur's Gate 3, which is technically canonically set within this time period, largely because I couldn't find an actual data sheet of all the NPC spellcasters in that game and whether they have class levels or not. I feel like that must exist somewhere, and someone really should do it to maybe add to this number or figure out what this number actually means on a multimedia standpoint, but I haven't been able to find that. I haven't been able to do that, and I've only played through the game twice, and so I'm not the exact expert to be able to tell you exactly where all the spellcasters are. I then removed any adventure that takes place primarily outside of the material plane, and I also skipped over any sort of mini adventures set outside the material plane as well. So we're not talking about Barovia, but we are discussing demi-planes and permanent portals which link a small section of a planar landscape to the material. I mean, I had to draw the line somewhere. For example, I've included Kresh Kalir, which exists on some asteroids outside of the atmosphere, but which is accessible using a permanent planar portal in Undermountain, but I've entirely skipped over one of the Candlekeep mysteries, which is set in the Feywild. Secondly, I have only counted non-innate spellcasters who are specifically and explicitly confirmed to exist by being included in direct textual reference as making a potential appearance to adventurers who follow the adventure as written. This does have some strange consequences. Waterdeep, as a massive sprawling overground city, only ends up with about 57 trained spellcasters, as opposed to the 104 who can be found in the Dungeon of the Mad Mage below the city. This is because Waterdeep Dragon Heist, the adventure where we get most of our information about Waterdeep, just doesn't detail that much of the city's magical infrastructure. We're only introduced to one spellcasting regular member of the Watchful Order of Magists and Protectors. And we're also introduced to next to no priests, clerics or spellcasters associated with religious houses, for example. This is where the absolute minimum clarification becomes really important. 959 is the number that we get if we only say that our players who go through these adventures are adhering to the exact guardrails of the adventure and do nothing outside of what is discussed. But I do count the maximum rolls of mages in things like random tables, because that is the maximum potential amount that we know does exist. We don't know that they're all on patrol at the same time, but we know that number of people does exist in canon because it's possible to encounter them. There is one area where I don't use the maximum amount of random encounters, which is Revel's End, the prison which serves as the opening setting of the newest D&D movie, Honour Among Thieves. This appears also in The Rise of the Frost Maiden, and has a random table to determine the status of the 299 prisoners contained within. You roll a d6 and it tells you how they ended up in prison. One of these 6 results is a spellcaster who is locked up for mentally influencing people using magic. And another of these 6 results is an adventurer jailed for causing massive collateral damage. To be fair, instead of assuming that all 299 could be spellcasters if you rolled 299 6s in a row, for instance, I chose to average these, and instead counted 50 out of the 300 as spellcasters under the first category, and 2/5 of those adventurers also as spellcasters, which accounts for 70 out of our total of 959. All of this means that I know for a fact that the number of mages that exist in Faerûn is significantly higher in reality. Waterdeep, as an example, is stated to have 15 temples to major deities, which would, in a metropolitan setting such as the City of Splendor, basically necessitate a senior priest, a collection of regular level 5 priests, and likely more than a dozen acolytes, all of whom are trained, leveled spellcasters. As an example, an advanced camp deep in the Cholton jungle has 1 priest and 6 acolytes, and some minor religious centres, even in small towns like Goldenfields, have 3 priests and 12 acolytes. The average religious trained spellcasting community in a notable site like a monastery or a fortress seems to hover somewhere between 10 and 20, fairly consistently across all modules that I looked at. So if you're actually accounting for every single monastery and temple in the world, you're well into the thousands from the off. But it is Icewind Dale, Rise of the Frost Maiden, that gives us our biggest clue in the magnitude of this undercount. In this module, it is clearly and unequivocally stated that for every 100 people in a town, there's 1 such individual among them. Specifically in reference to a friendly druid, priest or mage who can cast spells on the party's behalf. Up to 3rd level spells, by the way. At least some of these guys are 5th level casters. Icewind Dale is a remote, dangerous and bleak wasteland currently suffering an endless winter, and yet still 1 in 100 people remaining are trained casters. Not to mention that each camp of the Reghead Tribesmen has their own druid/shaman. Either Icewind Dale is a massive outlier and a haven for spellcasters, or this is a more normal expectation of how many people can cast spells in 5th edition's Forgotten Realms. By the way, even with this explicit confirmation of 1 in 100 people living in 10 towns being spellcasters, Rime of the Frost Maiden is only the most magical module because of that boost that it gets from Revel's End, that prison we discussed earlier. The prison which adds 70 different spellcasters to the total. Princes of the Apocalypse comes second, just by 10, with 148 leveled spellcasters who are explicitly mentioned, only 3 of whom, by the way, are cult fanatics. This is an adventure literally about taking on 4 different cults. There are more cult fanatics in both Dragon Heist and Candlekeep Mysteries, and in 3rd sits Out of the Abyss, a close 3rd, with 137 trained spellcasters. Remember, this is just an account of the non-innate spellcasters who are expected to be encountered by a party of completionist adventurers. Out of the Abyss also implies many more casters, such as the Council of Spiders, a set of an unknown number of drow mages, the Stoneheart Enclave, a group of Smurfneblin spellcasters, and a vast area in Gauntlgrim being reclaimed and excavated by teams of shield dwarf priests. None of these are given a number, so we can assume only 2 for each, which doesn't feel quite right. But that's what we get for going with the system of an absolute minimum. And again, this is without mentioning that in a not trained sense, every drow, dwergar and Smurfneblin in the entire Underdark has innate magic of their own. So with all of this magic floating about, how is it possible to have a 5th edition adventure with 0 trained spellcasters? Because there is one. It's Dragons of Stormwreck Isle. Both the Lost Mines of Phandelver and its expansion, the Shattered Obelisk, are also wildly low on confirmed casters. We're talking 7 across the entire 2-volume adventure. It seems that D&D's designers really hate to use spellcasters in starter adventures. I guess spellcasters generally are considered to make the game harder to run for the Game Master, but it is strange that these 2 locations really feel like dead magic zones. The big exception to this trend of starter adventures including very few spellcasters is Dragon of Icespire Peak, which is set around Phandalin like the Lost Mine of Phandelver. Dragon of Icespire Peak manages to just plop in a 20 strong, with 2 more recently deceased, but recently enough deceased that they fit within our 10-year window, rock gnome recluses, all of which who have training in magic. And it also makes the main enemy subtype the Anchorite of Talos, who are not trained spellcasters, but they are innate spellcasters, and they're numerous enough to at least earn a mention here. Unless I miss something, though, it is wild to me that the only spellcaster at all, innate or non-innate, found in the entirety of Stormwreck Isle is a flying kobold tinkerer who can cast Detect Magic once a day. There's barely any magic to detect. So what's the big takeaway? Adventuring parties of 4 people who spend a year of their life on a big adventure campaign in 5th edition will meet an average minimum of 80 spellcasters in that year, many of whom will be of a higher level than them. The 5th level priest, 18th level archmage, 9th level mage, and also the 10th level drow mage are among the most used stat blocks across all of these adventures, which certainly puts paid to the idea that our heroes are heroes because they're the best. There are so many NPCs of a much, much higher level, often in villainous roles, but of a much higher level than whatever our players are expected to get to. The official 5th edition Forgotten Realms are a place of magic, where magical talent or skill are not locked behind some genetic barrier called the gift. But magical skills are trainable, they're learnable, and they're actively useful in the daily workings and defence of society. Another consideration, really, is that so many of these adventures take place in relatively tiny regions of Faerûn. Most of the adventures never leave the Sword Coast, which is a small pocket on the side of a continent. And it's really worth internalising that when you run, make or write an adventure like this. Skip ahead if you don't want to be spoiled for Acts 1 and 2 of Rime of the Frost Maiden. But there is a point at which a hulking dragon construct terrorises the 10 towns. And this dragon makes it past many of these towns with barely a scratch. Putting aside that this creature only resists bludgeoning, piercing and slashing damage from non-magical attacks, for the moment, we're going to assume that it's immune. 40 people across these towns, by my calculations, could at the very least have been blasting this monster with cantrips. Even if 3/4 of our spellcasters fail their initial save against the dragon's charm, unless it hard targets every spellcaster immediately, that dragon doesn't make it past Bryn Shander. In a world with 40 spellcasters, up to level 5 by the way, across 10 settlements, even if your super weapon is immune to all physical damage, which this one isn't, sending it off alone to fight all 10 towns sequentially is not just the action of a madman, which, well, in fairness, the master of this dragon is a madman. They're the actions of someone whose writers have conveniently forgotten the high magic setting with helpful and competent NPCs that they set up. It is fine, genuinely, if your version of the Forgotten Realms has really very few casters. That's fine. It's fine if you can't think of a reason other than they've got other things to do, that the local 9th level mage would be less impactful than the scrappy 3rd level murder hobos. It is fine to make choices that make your game fun and playable. But please do pay some attention to the expectations that you set. 1 in 40,000, 1 in 9,000, and 1 in 100. They all imply vastly different worlds. Very interesting worlds, all of them. And the worst thing you could do, mid-story, is get yourself confused and dig yourself a magic-filled hole that needs its own 100-page backstory. The amount of people who exist outside of the locations that exist is most likely to be about 20 to 30 times the amount that are actually covered by these adventures. And if those population dynamics remain similar, if the makeup of society, if the makeup of spellcasters tends to be similar, then goodness knows what the number could actually be. I mean, in our dataset, there is one small pocket of time where our adventurers are found in Thay. They meet, I think, 25 or so trained spellcasters, or mages. That's a nation of mages, where their red wizards tend to populate or be dotted throughout all of the adventures across everything we're discussing, everything we're studying. They're everywhere. And so the amount of people just in Thay is insane. But we don't have access to that because we don't have population dynamics for there, and we don't have a confirmed number beyond the 25 or so that exist in Thay, and the maybe 24 that exist outside of Thay in various modular adventures across 5th edition. 959 doesn't sound so small a number now, right?